Let's start. I think I have the honors actually to have one of the last sessions of the whole conference. Well, not me only, but there are other breakout rooms as well. But I think after the break we have just the keynote session, and then we're done. But actually, I hope you find this talk interesting. This talk is about modern PHP in Joomla. It's a title I came up with after actually reading a book called Modern PHP. I didn't actually include it in the slides, but I will do that afterwards because it's a very interesting book to read about what other PHP developers are actually doing outside of the Joomla world. So for us Joomla developers, it's just really vital to know more about PHP, how it's being used, and so on. So actually this talk is just a little bit about Joomla, but much more about PHP itself and what kind of language constructs we have to make use of. The slides are available online, so you don't have to copy anything. And the only thing I'm gonna still do is modify the slide set so that this book title is actually also in there, so you can look it up later. My name is Jisse Reitsma. I'm from Jirio, a small company. I develop Joomla extensions and Magento extensions. Last year I also wrote a book on plugins, programming Joomla plugins. And I'm happy to announce for me actually that I brought a couple of books with me and they're all sold out. So after this I don't have any books to sell anymore. The lucky thing is also I hopefully, as soon as I come back home, I'm hoping to finish the conversion of the book itself, which is now only available in paper format, and try to convert it into an ebook. So as soon as that's done, it's also available online instead of having like the shipping costs between Europe and India, because I'm from Holland. I'm also proud actually to be part of a team of Zend. Zend is the maintainer, or actually the founder of PHP. So this talk is about PHP, so Zend is also like a very important party. And I did a bunch of stuff for Joomla and Zend, and because of that I'm also part of the Joomla Zend team. I have this company and I'm focusing on extensions, but slowly I'm also migrating into trainings. So I'm back home, I'm organizing a lot of different events. I'm organizing trainings, I'm organizing user groups. I'm organizing this thing called the Dutch Joomla PHP Developer Group. It's like a long title, but we were not allowed to call ourselves a Joomla user group. So that's why we just twisted around the words. And I think at this moment, actually, it's a Dutch Joomla Developer Group. So we dropped the word PHP. So we're also able to discuss like other stuff like Angular JS and JavaScript in general, jQuery and so on. So this talk is about PHP, and there's a couple of topics we're going to discuss. Interfaces, abstract classes, exceptions, things like mixins and traits. So first of all, maybe like a short introduction. How many of you are actually familiar with, well, the first of the bullet list, interfaces? So if we have a show of hands, then some of you are familiar with interfaces, some of you are not. But I think actually those who are not familiar with interfaces have still heard about it, or hopefully you did. So I'm going to explain that in basics, but most importantly, I'm actually going to explain the backgrounds of it, the reason why to use interfaces. So it's making sense to you to actually apply it. Exceptions, that's a thing that is very important now in Joomla. It's a new way of error handling. So instead of returning an error like we used to do in Joomla 1.5, we're actually supposed to deal with exceptions. So if you're developing your own extension or you're developing a plugin, a module, or component, actually adding exceptions is one of the more vital parts. And I'm going to give that a little bit of a twist to also show you that in Joomla itself, exceptions are already existing, but they make a small, well, call it mistakes, that could be improved actually in the code. Well, another thing that is similar to exceptions is namespaces, similar as in Joomla is slowly embracing it. So as soon as you're dealing with Joomla code itself, the Joomla framework, namespaces are important. But actually in your Joomla extensions at this point in time, there's not much need for namespaces, but it's new technology. Joomla is slowly starting to get involved into the namespace thing. So the more you know about it, the better you are prepared actually for the whole future. Closures and lambdas. Another show of hands. How many of you are actually familiar with closures or lambdas? Actually used it in PHP? Okay. This is actually like the fun part actually. So closures and lambdas are actually from different languages, other programming language than PHP. And they were introduced in PHP, but the number of times I actually needed it was 0. So I never needed it yet. But it's fun actually to deal with it anyway. And mixins and traits, some of you have been in my talk of yesterday or the workshop. So I dealt already with mixins and traits. I'm going to briefly explain it again just to make sure that you know what it is and how to implement it. So let's begin with interfaces and abstract classes. And we're going to deal with a lot of code. So if I hope you're prepared for code and seeing code and reading code, because we're going to see a lot of it right now. This is a basic example of how to use classes within Joomla. So this is an example that you have 2 separate classes. There's a class JModelList, that's like part of the Joomla framework. There's a second class, I just named it example model item, as part of an example component that you could perhaps create based on MVC. So if you're creating an MVC component, you would have code similar to this. It's not completely 100% correct. First of all, because actually the code you see on screen is actually shown in one slide, but actually the code itself would be located in 3 different files. So the first one is the class definition of JModelList, and JModelList is part of the Joomla core, so somewhere in the Joomla core there's this PHP file that contains code similar to this one. The second one is example model item, so that would be located in your own MVC component, located in the models folder of your component. And the third part is actually how to use that model. So where to use a model? Well, in MVC, you're supposed to use the model in a controller or a view. So MVC stands for model, view, controller. This is the model code, so you use it in the other 2 parts, the view or the controller. Now this is basic inheritance. So what you see is actually 2 classes, and the example model item class is extending the other class, the JModelList. Now JModelList is containing 2 functions. So that's getState and getItems. And what you also can see is actually that the getItems method is being overruled by the subclass. So the subclass example model items is containing a submethod called getItems. So instead of using the parent method, you're actually using the child method. So that's one element of actually using inheritance, that one class is extending the other class, so that a method of the parent class is actually being overwritten by the subclass, by the child class. The second thing that you can see right here is actually that the method getState is not included in the child class, so that the parent class has this function, but because the child class is extending the parent class, this getState method is automatically transferred more or less from the parent class into the child class. So that's the 2 elements we can see here with the inheritance part. Just to show you like a small example, this is again pseudo code, it's not real code, but this is code more or less similar to what I create in my own extensions. So I'm creating MVC components, and what I actually found was that the classes in the Joomla library are a little bit limiting. They're not doing exactly what I want to do. So instead of extending just the Joomla libraries, instead of extending the generic classes of MVC of Joomla, I'm actually extending on my own classes, my own parent classes, and they are contained in this Jirio library. And this Jirio library is again extending the original Joomla framework. So instead of extending directly from Joomla, I'm putting in between my own library classes to well, have less work basically to do. So what you can see here is Urion model list is extending from JModel legacy. JModel legacy is still containing two methods, get state and get data. And I actually made a mistake here in the slide. I thought I modified this properly. The get data method that you see in Urion model list should actually be get items. In example model items, the method should also be not get data, but get items. Because actually my whole point was that instead of using get data, as is defined in the Joomla framework, I like to call my methods more like get items or get item, because what kind of data I'm fetching, I want to be the entity that I'm getting. I want to be that part of the method name. So if I'm getting items, I want my method to be get items. Makes sense. So there's one reason actually to extend from the Joomla core, but then overrule it with your own functionality. And now actually if I go a slide back and we focus on the bottom part, you can see here that the model is being called upon. And then the model has this method called getItems and this method getState. So there's more or less this code within a view that is calling upon the model. And the view is assuming that the model has two methods, namely getItems and getState. So if the model would be lacking such a method, getState for instance, there would be PHP fatal error. So within my view, I have to know about the model actually and what kind of methods are included in this model to make use of it in the view. Well, I'm the creator of all this code, so I don't care. I have my own MVC component within the view, my own view. I'm calling upon a model, my own model, and whatever is inside that model, well, I already know about it in my view, so I just know how to implement my own code. But what if the model, for instance, Urion model list, is not created by myself, but by somebody else? I want to have more or less like a guarantee that this model is functioning in a certain way, so I can implement it also in a certain way. Well, the first way to do that is actually by reading the code. So what I could do, it's open source, it's PHP code. I'm opening up the file and I'm looking into it and reading like, oh, but there's a method get data or get items or get state. So then I can use it in my code. But you have to go through all the code to actually know that. And Urion model list is one model, it's one file. There might be hundreds of those models, and actually maybe what I want to do is actually implement all those hundreds of models in my own component, it might be. So then I have a lot of reading to do, a lot of work to do, actually to tell me what I need to do to implement that code. Well, so far we didn't discuss interfaces yet, but I'm slowly getting to the whole purpose of interfaces, because the problem is actually that if the code is being created by somebody else, you want to have a way, an easy way, to actually know what that code is doing. And the first way of doing that is reading the code, but that takes a lot of time. The other way would be conventions, to actually know that the other developer is doing it always in a certain way. And if I know that, then I don't have to find out what the developer actually is doing, but I only need to find out about the convention that the same developer sticks to. So if we're talking about Joomla, we all talk about standards, and we all talk about those standards because then we don't have to know the work of somebody else, we only have to discuss the standards. The problem is actually that if you only have a standard, you also trust the other person, you trust the other developer to actually stick with that standard. But if that other person would be unknowledgeable, so that person does not know enough about those standards, or, well, if the other person is lying, then my code suddenly doesn't work anymore. So, well, we're developers, and instead of actually trying to trust other people, we try to build code that is automatically trustable. So one way to do that is through abstract classes. So what you can see here is actually a model, but it's declared as abstract. And this is again more or less pseudo code, it's fake code, but this is similar to what you can find in the Joomla core. So there's this abstract class called JModelForm. it's having this function called getState. And then there's an abstract public function getForm. And this getForm method is not having the curly braces around it or behind it that actually defines functionality. So if you look at getState, I've put there 3 little dots. And the 3 little dots are actually showing that there's a body there. There's code functioning. And if you look at the getForm, after the declaration of the name and after the arguments, there's a semicolon right away, and there's no body. So there's no implementation of it. Well, the whole purpose of an abstract class is that the parent class, in this case JModelForm, is defining that there should be a getForm method, but there isn't yet. So if you want to make use of that class, you have to write up this getForm method yourself. So how many of you are familiar with abstract classes? Most of you. But none of you, or just a few of you, have heard of interfaces. Well, the fun part is actually, if you're looking at this code and you're familiar with it, you're also familiar with interfaces. The main difference between an interface and an abstract class is that this abstract class is actually doing 2 things. It's first of all implementing code called getState. So if you look at this JModelForm class and you look at the code, you will find out that there's this huge bunch of code contained within the method getForm. But then there's another thing that this class is doing, and that's actually defining that there should be a getForm method, or sorry, I'm twisting the two. So getState has a body. So if you look at that getState method, there's a whole bunch of PHP code in it. But if you look at the getForm method, it's empty. So while getState is actually adding functionality to the class, getForm is not, but getForm is functioning more or less like a guarantee that the subclass, so in our case example model item, is implementing it, is adding functionality. So if you look at the relationship between these classes, there's first of all inheritance. So the parent class and the child class, they are hooked to each other through this method called getState. So as soon as the child class is being instantiated, the getState method is being transferred into the child class. But the second thing that the abstract method is doing is actually that it's forming a contract between these 2 objects. So because the abstract class says there's this getForm method, it's not implemented yet, it's empty, the child class has to implement it. So there's a guarantee because of the abstract method that the child class has an implementation of getForm. And that's the whole purpose actually of abstract classes. The bad thing is actually that an abstract class is doing always 2 things. It's defining whatever that should be implemented in a child class. So it's making this contract. And it's adding functionality because it's also having methods like getState. So what is an interface? Well, an interface is only doing one thing. It's only focusing on the contract part. So whatever an interface is doing, it's never implementing code. So if you look at these methods getState and setState of this interface called JModel, there's no body, there's no functionality, there's no curly braces to define functionality. But what it's doing, it's only doing one thing. It's guaranteeing that JModel base, so subclass, which implements this interface, has these 2 methods. So the only reason why we have these interfaces is actually to guarantee that the subclass has a specific kind of methods with a specific kind of arguments, so it's functioning or is supposed to function in a specific way. I found interfaces always a little bit hard to think about, but the most important thing is to realize that an interface is forming a contract between the interface and the subclass. Because the interface is defining interface methods, you have a guarantee that the subclass is actually implementing these methods. And instead of actually talking about the subclass, you can talk about interfaces. So instead of talking about, well, have you written a class, a model class, which is doing some things with a state and getting the state and setting the state, which might be a really long story, you can say, does your method or does your class implement the interface JModel? And done. So interfaces is just another way of having a contract between 2 developers. And JModel is an interface included in the Joomla core. So it's actually showing that the Joomla core team wants to create contracts for us extension developers, so we follow the rules of the Joomla core, so that all the different components, all the different plugins and modules are all behaving in the same way, so that everybody can extend other one's code. Now, because I've actually shown that an interface and an abstract class are more or less the same thing, and the main thing is actually that an abstract class is doing the same thing as an interface, but it's doing another thing as well, I'm always coming up to a certain conclusion, because a method, for instance, should always do one thing. If you're writing up code, you want to have that code as clear as possible and as fragmental as possible. So if you look at a specific piece of code, you should immediately say, like, well, this code is doing this. And if it takes you more than 2 or 1 sentence, actually you're having an issue that the code is too complex. So one method should always do one thing. And actually the name of the method should describe that thing. So if you have a method with a name and you need a sentence actually to describe it, there's an issue. Well, the same is true for a class. A class should do one thing. An abstract class is by definition doing 2 things. It's implementing stuff and it's being an interface. And because of that, I think an abstract class is ugly, and we should actually move from abstract classes to interfaces. So how to do that? For instance, we have this class, abstract class JModelForm. It has 2 methods. It's implemented, it's having this child class called example model item. So this is exactly the same code we've seen just minutes ago. And we're going to turn the JModelForm actually into an interface. Well, the problem is that the JModelForm is already there. So instead of changing JModelForm, I'm just assuming, like, well, let's keep it there. But I'm adding a new contract, an interface JModelForm something, so I just call it JModelForm contract. Seems logical. And I'm implementing that code actually into my own class. So just to go back, this is the abstract class, and I'm removing the abstract part, and I'm actually moving it into a normal class, and I'm implementing an interface. So the troublesome thing actually here, what you can see is that we have more code. So slide back, this is about 10 lines of code, this is about 15 lines of code. There's more code, but actually the code is more explicit about what it's doing instead of before. And the main difference between the previous slide and this slide is actually that there's an interface. So there's a declaration that this class is behaving in a certain way. So as soon as you see another class which is also implementing this JModelForm contract, you know for sure that it's doing something with a form in a certain way. So it's standardization through code. So my recommendation is actually to implement JModel in all your models. JModel is itself an interface which has only a couple of these methods. So if I go a couple of slides back, I'm having here the JModel interface. It only has 2 methods, getState and setState. Well, that's always useful for your model. So whatever model you make sure it's implementing this interface called JModel. But that's not adding functionality. So you have this class, it's implementing JModel, but it doesn't include any functionality. So there's this bunch of classes called JModel Legacy, JModel Item, JModelForm, JModel Base. There's all this functionality contained in it. You can use it whatever you want, but that's up to you. That's like the choices you make when building an MVC component. When we talk about interfaces, it's just smart to implement your own. It's just smart to implement a contract that is very generic for all the models in Joomla, so that's JModel. So besides actually this JModel interface, it could also be a smart thing to do to actually create your own interfaces. For instance, if you have one model that is doing a certain thing, and you're creating a second component that is doing exactly the same thing again, but under a different name, and a third component, then you are duplicating this functionality. And that's not bad. Copy and pasting, that's okay. But if you want to guarantee that that copy and pasting that you can do that still in 1 year time, actually by implementing your own interface for all these 3 different components will guarantee actually that your component code will still be implementing the same kind of code in 1 year time. So the funny thing is actually if you're defining your own interface, you're creating a contract with yourself, and that doesn't make sense actually in the beginning, but actually if you understand that you yourself are also changing in time, making a contract with yourself is a way of allowing yourself to change, evolve in the future as well, but not to break your old code. And whatever you want to do with those interface names, for instance, I'm creating here an example model contract. I don't know what's inside it, but it's just a concept that you can create your own interfaces. Another good thing to do is actually to document your code. So if you have a model that is actually extending from a parent class, and it's implementing JModel, and it's also implementing your own interface, you have a subclass that is actually extending from 3 different classes. Well, every method could originate from one of those subclass or parent classes. So if you want to know actually what kind of parent class is defining that method, so what kind of method is being overwritten by a parent class, just add it into your own PHP code using a PHP doc statement. So there's this @c sign or tag that you can just simply use to refer to the parent code for later reference. This was the first topic. The second topic is exceptions. Exceptions are, well, first of all, how many of you are familiar with exceptions? Most of the hands. That's good, so I'm continuing a little bit faster. The main thing is an exception is another way of actually building a contract. So instead of actually having a method do something, and then if it fails to do something, you return false, instead of actually doing that, you could also generate an exception. And by generating an exception in one place, so with throw new exception, you're actually creating a new issue, and that is that the code that is referring to your code has to catch this exception. Because if you don't catch an exception and the exception occurs, you get a PHP fatal error. Actually by adding exceptions, you make the code more complex. By doing this, you're actually also creating like a guarantee between the place where the exception occurs and the place where the exception is caught. So that's again like a relationship, and that relationship functions as a contract. So here's an example. Let's say I have a generic PHP class that is logging. It's writing to a log. And let's say that if the log file itself is not writable, then we have an issue, because then we can't write to the log. Well, as soon as that's happening, actually we throw a new exception, and then in the class or in the code that is actually referring to this class, so for instance, I want to log to a certain file, I have to check for this try exception, or I have to use this try catch statement to make sure that whenever the log file is not writable, my code is still functioning a certain way. So this is the basic code you can use. The funny thing is actually that that code is wrong. And for those of you who are familiar with exceptions, I bet actually that this is new, and this is also done wrongly in the Joomla core. The main point of an exception is, well, it has 2 functions. First of all, there's an exception, something goes wrong. The second thing about an exception is that if something is going wrong, you actually want to say also what went wrong. So if I go back to the code here, the exception is being thrown. That's number 1. So there's an error handling. But the second thing is actually that the error handling itself is saying unable to write to the log. So there's a message actually being passed through the place where the error occurs to the place where actually the error should be handled. So that's cool. The only issue is actually that here you can see catch exception E, and that the code itself is able to print the error message. But in the code itself, it's not really clear what happened. because perhaps this piece of code wants to react differently if the log file itself was simply not writable, or actually if the log file was not writable because the file system is full. Because that's a completely different situation, and you maybe want to handle that in a different way as well. So actually, instead of using an exception, you should actually use a sub-exception, which is basically a child class of the parent class exception. So there's this generic code called an exception, a parent class that has all the basic functionality needed for this to work. But instead of using that parent class, you should be using one of these classes. So there's bad method call exception, invalid argument exception, and so on. Unfortunately, there's no exception called file system full exception. Well, the lucky thing is actually you can create those yourself. Sorry? I can't hear you because of the... Yeah, so it's really easy actually. You mean the file system full exception is already there? But exactly. Well, there's many different ones, and actually when I'm creating my own exceptions, I'm first studying this list thoroughly to actually see, like, well, what kind of name is actually matching. So if I'm having like a text area that is containing too many characters, so there's a post being made after a form, and the text area is containing more characters than are actually allowed, then it could be a length exception or an invalid argument exception, and I basically just pick one. But it's important actually to realize that when your own code becomes more reusable, your own code is being used by more people, then it becomes more useful actually to create your own exceptions. And how to do that, it's very, very simple. Just create a class that is extending from exception. And this is the full example. So there's no implementation needed, there's no body needed. You simply declare the class and extend from exception. The fun stuff is that you still can do more stuff with it. So instead of actually accepting the default arguments, you could modify the message itself, so that's being shown here. Or when the error exception itself is being printed, then the toString method is actually being used, and you could do fun stuff with it as well. But this is like optional, and you don't have to do this. So the first step, a slide back, is just to create code like this. Namespaces. Just a question in between, how much time do I still have? 10 minutes? Okay. But then we have a 15-minute break, so... Namespaces, it's a difficult topic. How many of you are used to namespaces or have played with it already? Much less. The main point of namespaces is, what I always do is I compare it to folder structures. So if a file is normally in a certain folder structure, a class is now in a namespace. And even easier, if a file is normally containing a class, then the folder structure and the namespace structure are actually the same. So you can see that here, right here in my example, that the namespace JWC15 dynamic 404 helpers, and this is again fake code, but well, it could be there. It's actually contained in the file system in more or less the same location. So there's the libraries folder of Joomla, and there I'm placing all my subclasses. To use a namespace, you always begin with a namespace declaration. It should be in the top of the file, and after that you are actually inside this namespace. So the full path of this class matching is actually JWC Dynamics 404 helpers matching, and all with backspaces instead of normal, not backspaces, backslashes instead of forward slashes to make clear like it's not a file system, but a namespace. And to use it, you either refer to the absolute path, more or less like in namespaces, or you can include a namespace. And including a namespace basically says you take part of this full path and you chop off the parts that you want to include in your own code by using this use method. And And then from then on, you can just assign like or use the classes that are inside that namespace. So I think the code sample already explains it a little bit. That also this use function allows you to create an alias of an alias of the class itself. So the class itself was still matching, but actually I'm renaming it to dynamic 404 matching because I find it useful or whatever. Now, the interesting thing is actually namespaces are not new in PHP. They've been existing in PHP since 5.3, I think, or even earlier. But they're new in Joomla. And basically in Joomla, there's the legacy framework, or the legacy libraries. There's the CMS libraries, there's the Joomla libraries, but there's also the framework, the Joomla framework. And currently, the Joomla framework is, I think, already completely based on namespaces. And slowly, the Joomla framework is being integrated also into the CMS. So one of the major changes you're going to see in the future, I'm not sure if that's the near future or the far future, but somewhere in the future, all the components, modules, plugins, they're going to be renamed to namespaces. So you have to get ready, because that's like a huge change in all your code. The problem is actually that I tried to find, like in the CMS space, what kind of namespace is already in use. And I was preparing for like a long bullet list. And I came only to one match, that is the J registry, which is already actively being renamed to a namespaced version. So currently there's like little to do to convert your own code. Well, you start with this one. There's more, or? Utilities, yeah. I overlooked that. So there's already, well, in other words, actually, there's code already in the Joomla framework, which is already namespaced. So it's just really interesting also to look through the Joomla framework instead of looking through the libraries, the older libraries, and take your pick actually from the newer framework and convert all the code that you have with the old Joomla CMS libraries and convert it into the new Joomla framework. So the utilities are there. There's actually a lot of code there, but I looked through the Joomla components, the core components, and this was like one of the few things I could find. So my recommendations is actually you should start converting your code, but the code conversion, well, you mainly do that in your own methods or in your own classes, so in your helper classes, library classes. You can't touch really your MVC classes yet, because the MVC classes depend actually on the rest of the Joomla framework. You can still attempt a few things, but then it's like a weird combination between namespaced code and non-namespaced code. So I recommend you focus on like non-MVC classes, and then when the Joomla core is ready, actually convert your code into namespaces then. So I thought, like in the beginning of my slides, I mentioned 5 different points. So this is point number 4, closures and lambdas. I'm only going to briefly explain it. The main thing to remember is actually that there's this thing called a closure, which is a function without a name. When I heard about this, I was scratching my head like, well, do I need this? And as of today, I still have I'm struggling with like finding a purpose for this to be useful. Anonymous functions are exactly the same. So there's sometimes a little bit talk about anonymous functions being new into PHP together with closures. Well, that's nonsense, because closures and anonymous functions are the same thing. Lambdas, though, are different. And when you look at the specification, they always say like, well, closures and lambdas and so on. But actually, the main difference is not that big, so I'm going to show you. So a regular function looks like this. There's a function declaration. It has a name, hello world. And the function hello world has an argument, the name variable. And I can use that variable inside the function itself. And then I have my user code. And in this case, I'm assigning the name John Doe to it. And then I'm calling upon hello world, and actually there's a typo there as well. The $sign should not be in the last hello world. So again, like I'm gonna fix my slides, right? An anonymous function looks like this. So instead of having a name, it doesn't have a name. So this is a closure. Why is it useful? I don't have a real example for that because I didn't really find it useful, but you can assign this function to a variable. So for instance, actually if I go slide back, the last line in my code is wrong because it's a call to a function called hello world, and a hello world should not be preceded by a $sign. Well, with a closure, with an anonymous function, it should be. So actually, those two lines, right, or the last line right there, is a good example of how to use a closure. Well, the use case of a closure is just not that big. It's very useful for languages that are run on the fly because they deal with memory and so on. But actually, in PHP, there's PHP accelerators, there's XendOPC, there's APC, and there's all these kinds of tricks actually to make the code run faster. And at that point, actually, an anonymous function, a closure, is less useful. So for me, actually, I've read some things about anonymous functions, and I've seen only like the example code online, and I've not seen yet a framework that is actually implementing it real life for a good reason. Laravel, yeah? Mm. Yeah, oh yeah, callback functions, that's one of the main reasons actually to still do it. But then the question still comes, is it better to have a callback function declared as an anonymous function, or can you just declare it instead like a regular function? And that discussion is not complete. Well, but let's discuss that in the break. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but then we talk about memory, or we talk about lines of code, and actually the lines of code that we win is not that much. So that's like the difficult thing. But it's there anyway. So yeah. A closure, exactly the same thing as an anonymous function. The only difference is that a variable from outside of the scope of the function. So in this case, like the global scope, so the name variable, can be inserted into actually, I was talking about not closures, I was talking about lambdas. I'm getting a little bit sick, so I put down these slides, I improved these slides this afternoon, and actually I didn't improve them, I made them worse. I was saying like my example for a closure was not finished. Well, it is, here it is. So you can see in the last line there's this hello world, which seems like a variable, but it's actually a variable containing a function. So that's the closure I was actually wanting to mention. While this is a lambda, and a lambda is the same as a closure, and the main difference is actually that it has this use statement. So similar to what we've seen what we're going to see with traits. This lambda is using a variable which is outside of the scope of the function itself. So first we're defining a function. First we're defining a variable called name outside of the scope of the function. So that's the global scope, and we're inserting that variable into the scope of the function, and then it becomes like an internal variable within that function. So that's a lambda. So a lambda is exactly the same as a closure, but it just messes around with the scope of variables a little bit, and then it becomes a fancy name called lambda. Yeah.
I understood the difference between lambdas and closures.
Yeah.
But it's completely opposite in JavaScript and Python.
I heard about that in JavaScript. I have to.
What you described as lambda.
Yeah.
Actually, closure in Python.
Oh, really?
Yes, even in JavaScript.
Well, then.
What you described as closure.
Yeah.
That is actually anonymous functions and lambdas.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Maybe I'm making a mistake, but I thought I completely understood this. But because I'm not feeling well, completely 100% well, I'm believing you for like, I'm going to correct my slides afterwards. So if this is a mistake, then it's going to be fixed.
The example is correct.
Yeah, exactly.
The terminology has to be revised.
Yeah.
I feel that this is closure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is actually that closures and anonymous functions were added to PHP a while ago, and lambdas were just introduced recently. So that's well, yeah. let's look it up later, and then the main reason also why I'm maybe making this mistake is simply because I'm not using it, and I haven't found that many people using it either, so there were almost no hands, and I still don't see a way actually, well, callback functions, but you can still use callback functions in a different way. So, yeah. So that's also my recommendation to do. Even though my story makes little sense, actually I found it really useful for you to actually know about this, because as soon as you know the things outside of the scope that you already know, then you can start growing and make use of it. So in Joomla, don't expect this actually to show up soon, but actually outside of the Joomla, like in Laravel, it's already finding its place. So that's why it's actually interesting to know about it anyway. Last but not least, a spelling mistake, because actually the G should not be there.
Hello.
The problem actually of inheritance that we've seen before was that we saw there are these classes that can extend from parent classes, but multiple inheritance, so extending one class from actually two parents is not possible. To solve that issue, there are different options, there are different solutions, and one of the main ones is actually that within PHP 5.4, I'm switching the two a little bit because the other one is more complex, traits were introduced. And what is a trait? A trait is actually a declaration of a class, simply replacing the definition class with the keyword trait, so it becomes a trait instead of a class, and then turning it actually into something that could be reused by one single class multiple times. So let's see that in action. What you see right here is a normal class. It's extending from a parent class. And now comes the fun part actually. The sub-example method or sub-example class doesn't have any methods, so that's clear. Let's assume that the parent example also does not have any methods or almost no methods, and that actually this method alert is coming from somewhere else. So that's the whole point of a trait, that instead of having the normal inheritance of having a parent class or a subclass contain a specific method, this method called alert is actually coming from somewhere else. And where is it coming from? A trait. So here you can see actually that the parent class also does not have a declaration of this method called alert, but instead it just uses a trait. So it declares with this keyword use that it wants to use a trait. And then this trait is called alertable, and it has one single method called alert. And actually by using that trait, all the methods of that trait are inserted into the parent class. And the main reason why I actually used the example, just a slide back, of a subclass and a parent class, is that you now can see actually that the subclass is using this method called alert without actually seeing any code related to it. So that's what you see happening with traits a lot. You have classes, you have subclasses, and they make use of methods. But then if you start searching for those methods, the methods are not there. Why not? Because the methods are not inside the class itself, they're inside the trait. So you have to look for the trait to get to know the method itself. Well, that's confusing, because you're actually using a method called alert, but where to find this method called alert? And that's where actually the standardization comes in. PHP developers want to help each other, so by settling for a certain standard, it becomes useful. And one of these standards is actually that a trait should do something. It should do something. It's not an entity, like a model. A model is a container for data, or a model is a container for functionality. A trait is a container for stuff that can be done. And the name of the trait should also be something that is able of something. So alertable, it's a strange word, and I don't even think that it's existing in English, but it makes sense because it's immediately saying like, well, if you implement this trait, if you're using this trait, your own class becomes insertable. They can do stuff with it with alerts. So that's part of my recommendations, but before we get to that, we still have the mixin part, and then I'm almost done. The mixins and the traits are almost similar, but a trait is actually defining the relation between what is being inserted and the parent class that is actually using it. And you use the use keyword for that declaration. Now the bad thing, or the bad thing, is that when you are coding all these classes, then you have to think of this keyword use, then you have to think of the functionality of alertable. But what if you have a model that is not alertable unless it needs to be? Well, then it's in runtime, actually, that this model is changing behavior and is actually suddenly being able to do something with alerts. For instance, if the model is referring to a database entry, and this database entry has a flag called alert, and if alert is 0, there's no behavior called alertable, but if the flag is 1, suddenly that same model becomes alertable. So then in runtime, actually, you have to decide on that. And at that point, traits are not something you want to use, but mixins are. And the reason why I'm showing mixins after the traits is actually because mixins are more complex. This slide is almost identical to it. So the only thing is that the subclass is now suddenly declaring also, hey, I'm alertable. So in this example, I'm declaring this mixins array, but you could also do this halfway in between. So when the database record is being fetched, at that moment you're inserting something to this array called mixins. And what is that something? Well, it's the alertable behavior based on this flag in the database. And to make that all happen, it's all code, and that all code is actually based on a single trick, and that single trick is basically that the magic method called __ call is being implemented. So whenever a method is not found in a class, PHP will look for the method called call. So that's a magic class, you don't have to do anything for it, but if you want to do something for it, if you want to do something with it, you can override that method and do something magical like this with it. So we've seen actually a bunch of things. I'm going to round up, but my recommendations for the traits and the mixins is actually to use both whatever you want with it. And that's actually almost part of the end of my presentation, except for these little pointers. I'm not going to explain it. I was not meant to explain it, even when John was looking at me like, you have to... I was only showing this to you actually that there's much more to discover about PHP. So my 5 points are just part of like the bigger scheme of the PHP language evolving. And there's a lot of things that are interesting to learn about. And the most important thing is also that the Joomla project is also evolving all the time. So while the Joomla core developers are also finding out about this cool stuff, actually so should you. So by diving into these things, well, PHP becomes more interesting. So basically, it's time to play. Well, thanks so much. You can contact me afterwards, but I think first I have to step down really quickly and make place for the keynote. But afterwards, I'm ready for you, and I'm ready actually for a discussion still on the lambda closure thing, whatever, so we can correct that. So thank you.